Hello, and welcome to Emerging Viewpoints. I'm Nick Stoppmiller. Today we're joined by Maria Shagina to discuss the impact of sanctions on Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine and considerations for designing additional measures. Dr. Shagina is a visiting senior fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and an adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security. She has extensive experience consulting with government agencies and the private sector on issues of energy security and sanctions. In 2020, she was selected as a GlobSec Young Leader and a member of the European Leadership Network. Maria, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Nick. Happy to be here.
Since February, we've seen the US, Europe, and their allies respond with remarkable speed and coordination, introducing a raft of sanctions on Russia in response to its war in Ukraine. And it seems more sanctions are in the pipeline, with the EU currently working on a sixth round of measures. The effects of the restrictions in place will take time to feed into the Russian economy, however. Bank of Russia Governor Elvira Nabiullina expects economic impact to intensify through this quarter and next, and talks about an underlying structural transformation that will face the Russian economy because of supply bottlenecks and other issues as a result of those sanctions. Can you please elaborate, Maria, on what economic effects for Russia you anticipate from the current sanctions and how long those will take to feed through?
Indeed, the recent barrage of sanctions, the continuing new rounds of sanctions will have a devastating impact on the Russian economy. And we should state it from the very beginning, from the get-go. The objective of sanctions is to erode this fortress Russia strategy, the ample international reserves that Russia has accumulated and was meant to sanction-proof the Russian economy from any external influence prior to February 2022. With the measures that we've seen that have been put in place, that's questionable because you have half or two-thirds of Russia's international reserves being frozen. You have unprecedented sanctions in terms of full blocking sanctions on major Russian banks now, Sberbank, VTB, Alfa Bank, and so on, systemic banks, in fact. You also have 7 banks that have been de-SWIFted. So those measures are unprecedented in its magnitude and applied vis-a-vis a G20 economy, measures that never been put in place with this scope and swiftness. So the impact will unravel as sanctions is a long-term tool with cumulative effects, and we have to divide the impact short, mid-term, and long-term. So long-term, in a way, is easier to predict, paradoxically. And I think Elvira Nabiullina summarized it quite succinctly. It's a structural transformation of the Russian economy, and all signs point to economic recession and a looming default. Russia is going back in times to the 90s, the period that is not necessarily associated with anything positive for ordinary Russians because it means depression, poverty, and scarcity of basic food and items. The short term, as we've seen them in the immediate couple of days after sanctions have been imposed, we saw inflation rising, we saw a bank run, people withdrawing a lot of cash. More than $10 billion were withdrawn from on one weekend, I think, back then in February. The Central Bank of Russia was quite quick coming with damage controls. And this is what they've been good in 2014. And now they have prepared for some of the sanctions options. They haven't prepared for the central bank's reserves being frozen. But the measures that were put in place have helped to stabilize economy as much as it could have been done. And we see now the headlines that the ruble has rebounded, that might mean that sanctions are not working. I would caution how to read the signs on the ruble stabilizing, because it's a false sense of stability, sort of the Russian way or post-Soviet way, how to stabilize it by way of controlling it. And ruble is artificially maintained. That doesn't mean that the economy is fixed and is fine. The budget might be fine because of the high oil prices, gas prices, but it doesn't mean that the Russian economy is fine and immune. So midterm is a bit more muddled because it also depends on the new rounds of sanctions, on also Western companies, how they're going to behave. So on top of sanctions, we've also seen now an exodus of Western companies, again, unprecedented, has never happened, at least to my best of my knowledge. And we saw now 800 companies have withdrawn, and that amplifies the impact of sanctions in terms of disrupting supply chains and falling imports on top of the initial sanctions impact. So the central banks of Russia, again, very nicely put it in words that we will see a structural transformation, and we'll see a reverse industrialization. So long term, we'll see a decoupling of Russia commercially, financially, technologically. Russia will rely less on less advanced technology, will rely more on less advanced technology. And also with the upcoming oil embargo, potentially gas, we can discuss it later, we'll see an energy decoupling. And this is the major hit for the Russian economy, because energy versus Western technology, Western financing is this key formula how the trade structure of the Russian economy has been set up for years. So long term, the prospects are very bleak, and doesn't mean the Russian economy will collapse. We have examples of Iran, North Korea surviving under maximum pressure campaign, but the prospects are bleak in terms of prosperity, in terms of attracting any new investments. So it's not very positive, I'm afraid.
Okay, so after going through the how and the what, let's go to the question of to what end, because sanctions experts such as yourself have long talked about the fact that sanctions don't usually correct behavior. You can't usually coerce a country to change course through sanctions, although there can be some benefit in terms of deterring future behavior. But the case of Russia is quite interesting, as one official, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, recently said that the purpose of these sanctions is the goal is essentially to weaken the Russian economy to the point where it's unable to use its war machine to invade neighbors in the future. So it seems like there's a real security goal there. And my question to you is, do you think this goal is realistic? And if so, what additional sanctions do we need in order to affect that change?
Indeed, the critics always point to one of the objectives of sanctions is its inability or very low percentage of cases where it did manage to change behavior. And this is something was, again, bringing up North Korea, Iran, and historically other countries on which sanctions were imposed. And statistically, the number is not impressive. It's below 20%. So on this, we have to, again, underline and pace our expectations with sanctions, what they can achieve under what conditions, and also not to expect too much in terms of wishful thinking, what they can achieve by targeting economy, magically avoiding collateral damage, splitting the elites, and achieving regime change or behavioral change. So that is not the case, and sanctions, again, is only one tool in the toolbox of economic statecraft and needs to be propped up by a larger strategy in the background. So, as you said, the US and then the West in general defined the first step, the first objective is to erode Russia's ability to fund this war. That means the financial sanctions that have been put in place work towards it. But the main weakness that is currently in place and meant to be fixed next week and so on, energy sector. The current production of oil and gas have not been targeted. all sanctions, export controls that have been put in place are all dancing around new investments, something long term, but it's not targeting the current production. And by that, Russia has been receiving up to $1 billion per day from its exports of oil, gas, and coal. And if the objective is to erode Russia's ability to fund the war, we're in a paradox where we're giving money to the Russian government, which will funnel it towards its military machine, and then the EU and the West in general have then the expenses towards Ukrainians in terms of humanitarian aid, refugees, and so on. So that seems counterproductive. But this weakness obviously comes from domestic vulnerability, in particular when it comes to Europe, because Europe is so dependent on Russian oil and gas. So the work that we're seeing today is a major step up in pressure if oil embargo is implemented, and it looks like it's going to be done next week or so. And this will tighten the screw for the Russian government, how much money they can redirect to fund this war. So I think it's a major step up. The other issue here with sanctions is that while we have this objective, we don't have a clearly defined endgame. To erode Russia's ability to fund the war towards what? The ending is not clearly defined there. Are we hoping for military defeat, as you said, that there will be no future aggression, either it's Ukraine or we have now Transnistria, destabilization around Moldova? Whether it's constrain Russia's ability to achieve negotiations and settlement with Ukraine? Is it a peace agreement? Is it a ceasefire? So I think that these political components are not clearly defined towards how sanctions should be working towards this political component of this whole formula.
Well, this is interesting because if there's not pure clarity on the political endgame of what these sanctions are meant to achieve, what does that say about the timetable? I mean, is it reasonable to expect some sort of significant sanctions relief if there is a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, however likely or unlikely that is? Or do you think these sanctions are likely to stay in place indefinitely as long as the current regime is assessed as a threat by the West?
I think it very much depends on the future sanctions that will be put in place, and also on the amount of military aid that will be given to Ukraine. Because we can't expect, as I said at the beginning, that sanctions will be able to solve all of these problems at once. It's one of the components, one of the instruments here, and the military side here will be very much shaping the outcome of the war. It will be decided on the battlegrounds, and sanctions is this tightening screw, but maybe not the most decisive here. So sanctions relief is important from sanctions perspective. If we look at sanctions literature, it needs to be conditioned towards something, right? And as I said, the end game is not very much clear. And at the moment, we're not talking about sanctions relief as such, because I think lifting sanctions to communicate it to Russia that we're talking about lifting sanctions while they are advancing in Ukraine, I think strategically is not the smartest thing to do, because you're sending the wrong signal. We can emphasize conditions, whether it's full unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine. As I said, there are other ideas that have been floated among policy circles, what the condition can be. So I think this is where the emphasis should be. But long term, again, the prospects are not very good, because we know that lifting of sanctions is problematic, not just for the Russian sanctions regime, but also for other countries, how to lift them. And historically, the previous sanctions on Soviet Union stayed there for 20 years, were lifted, and 1 year later the US imposed Magnitsky sanctions. So this part of the equation, how sanctions work, is problematic, but at the moment we're still at the very beginning of this equation, right? How to work towards the relief is important, But I think concentrating on conditionality, what Russia should do vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis the security architecture in Europe is, I think, more important at the moment.
You talked a little bit earlier about the sensitivities around oil and gas because of Europe's heavy dependence on Russian energy exports. And I wanted to ask you, to what extent do policymakers think about these blowback effects of sanctions, and particularly where we are in the case of Russia, where such severe sanctions have been imposed already? I mean, are there additional sanctions that could be unleashed against Russia that wouldn't have these blowback effects on the US, Europe, and their allies? And how important do you think that is in designing the next round of sanctions?
I think we had a quite bad example where, companies of Deripaska, like Deripaska, Russian billionaire, were targeted. And that's maybe prime example how not to do sanctions, because if you want to target something that is too big and too systemic, you need to think it through. And that was the example how not to do it. And I think right now we have unprecedented coordination and thinking from the very beginning, from the design of sanctions, how to mitigate everything unintended, collateral damage. Again, we need to pace our expectations that some of it will still be there. It's not like sanctions is a silver bullet that can, as I said, solve every problem and left everyone untargeted here who is not meant to be untargeted. But if we look at the first sanctions rounds that have been placed against Russia, well, the collateral damage can be directed both ways, vis-a-vis the population and vis-a-vis third countries or the sender states. So if we talk about population, this is the concept of smart sanctions that has been designed in the 90s after the Iraq War, how to avoid targeting civilian population. The problem that we have now is that, again, those are unprecedented sectoral sanctions that aim to undermine the Russian economy. It's very hard to make it so surgical that it won't affect ordinary Russians. Because we are in a context of an authoritarian state that is responsible for the distribution of sanctions pain. There is only so much we can do to affect how that sanctions pain is distributed. Having said that, as I said, smart sanctions, the concept is meant to always include these humanitarian exemptions, that medicine, food, agricultural aspects are never targeted, but that is on paper, right? With the exodus of Western companies, we have disruption of supply chains, we have Western companies just in terms of reputational damage and also operational costs. They withdrawing, and the pharmaceutical sector is particularly impacted, that ordinary Russians do not have perhaps good access now to medicine. There are ways to solve it, that you have to talk closer to the private sector, how to solve it. As I said, it's not a silver bullet even with the smart sanctions. Maybe they can be smarter, but on paper, legally, those items should never be targeted, and they are, in fact, have exemptions on this. When it comes to the sender state, and you mentioned Europe with oil and gas, that is, in fact, what is on the mind, for example, in Germany, how to avoid self-inflicting costs, how to avoid deep recession by imposing oil embargo on Russia. And here it all starts, the economic statecraft starts from building domestic resilience, because the less vulnerable you are, the more freer you are in imposing sanctions. And here, countries within the EU are not equally exposed to Russian oil or gas. And there's been some progress, right? Even within Germany, that German government is thinking about increasing its LNG capacity, finding alternative suppliers from Qatar, from the US. So the domestic work needs to be done to be less vulnerable to those costs. But again, from sanctions literature, the credibility of sanctions always starts from your willingness to bear the costs. So there are only here fewer examples where you have a perfect asymmetrical weapon and you stay immune. The US was the dollar can be one of the examples, but in close interconnected economies, you should be prepared to either be more immune for your economy or should be prepared to pay more costs. So again, there is no perfect solution there. And also for the third countries, the collateral damage here comes in relation to wheat supplies, because both Russia and Ukraine supply more than 30% of the world wheat market, and that will affect countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So I think here where I haven't seen a lot of contingency planning, how to mitigate those unintended consequences, vis-a-vis if we talk about the energy contingency planning that has been done. But this is the new front where the West maybe should be looking closer.
Well, you talked a bit about unintended consequences and what's on paper in sanctions and what actually happens in practice. And I want to throw out another scenario to you. What happens if additional sanctions are introduced against Russia and there's a retaliation that the Russians, for example, just on their own unilaterally cut off gas supplies to Europe? To what extent do you think policymakers are thinking about that contingency as they design sanctions that don't target gas specifically? And what can policymakers do to mitigate those types of risks?
Well, I think we know that Russia already threatened to cut off Poland and Bulgaria, so they are making the first step to threaten it as one of the retaliation. But here I think they only have this energy weapon in terms of gas only in the short term. Because as I said, long term, we're looking at energy decoupling. By 2030, when decarbonization will kick in, Russia will not have the same place as it has now in terms of providing this energy bridge. So they can threaten it for now to use it because of the oil embargo. They have this opportunity to do so. But they are also cutting themselves from additional revenues. While gas is not as important as oil and its revenues from this sector, due to the high gas prices on the energy markets, it's also now a substantial chunk of revenues for the Russian government. So they can threaten it, but I think we also need to understand, or I'm sure they will understand, that that's hurting themselves as well. So this is something that I don't know how serious that they will be in this respect. But when it comes to the possibility of introducing gas embargo, I think we are in a more complicated situation. Oil is more fungible, there are more suppliers. At the moment, as I said, because there is this strong domestic vulnerability, in particular in Germany and Italy, you have less opportunities, how to diversify quickly, how to attract more LNG, different suppliers perhaps from Africa, how to maybe be more energy efficient in home. So there are ways how to do it, but short term it doesn't look great. So we're looking at mid-term, long-term possibility of phasing gas from Russia.
So, something you mentioned early on in this talk is the fact that there's this paradox that Europe is supporting Ukraine, providing a variety of logistical help as well as direct financial help to try to counter Russia's invasion. But at the same time, upwards of $1 billion, €1 billion rather, a day is going to Russia for oil and gas that they're selling into Europe. And so my question is it possible to disrupt Russia's economy sufficiently with the sanctions that are in place, or do we need a European oil and or gas embargo in order to achieve those aims?
I think this is the key cash cow for the Russian budget. It accounts for up to 50% depending on the gas and oil prices. And at the moment, we are in a tight energy markets. So, this is the key vulnerability of the current sanctions regime. So, we have the US, the UK, Canada that already have those restrictions vis a vis Russian gas, oil, LNG, coal. The Europeans now imposed coal ban, which will start mid-August, but that is a tiny bit of revenues that is flowing to the Russian budget. So oil and now gas, because of high gas prices, is the key. This is where we need to hit the Russian economy if the objective is to erode Russia's ability to fund the war. So, as I said, the decision to trigger it is, I think, very important because we didn't even discuss such an option in January. That was unthinkable. That bridge would be down, right? Because Germany is so much tight, toxic relationship that has been forged for since 70s, right? So the thinking has changed quite rapidly since January, for example, when we were only threatening with SWIFT. Now we have other measures in place. So the oil and gas embargo is the key, but it doesn't mean that we can stop here, right? That would be on the scale of 10, that would be around 8% in terms of 8 points in terms of intensity. We still have loopholes that the Russians can use. And I think the way now the upcoming oil embargo is implemented, the precise wording is, I think, very important. Because if insurers are targeted, we're looking at 70% of Russian tankers won't be able to ship this oil even to China and India. And this is this asymmetric leverage, the asymmetric weapon that the West still has, the high dependency of Russia on Western insurers. So, and then apart from loopholes, right, we have third countries that didn't align. And as I mentioned, China and India are the key here. So another step to tighten the sanctions would be secondary sanctions. But that requires a lot of coordination between the Europeans because Europeans are very much allergic to anything extraterritorial coming from the US. So we need to be careful and keeping the united front on both sides of the Atlantic.
And finally, I want to ask you briefly, how important are these oil sanctions? Because you mentioned earlier, oil is much more fungible than gas. So assuming the Russians are able to get some of the shipping and logistical and insurance issues that you mentioned, they can always ship elsewhere. But on the gas front, there's a very strict, I mean, it's a mutual vulnerability, but it's not easy for the Russians to reroute that gas, at least for the next several years. So how big of a deal is the oil sanctions package versus a possible gas sanction in the future?
So, in a way, they are similar in terms of infrastructure bottlenecks. Gas is more fungible and can be rerouted through maritime routes, but at the moment, a lot of oil is shipped to Europe via pipelines. So we have Druzhba pipeline, that's been since Soviet times. So to reroute a vast amount of oil, which is Russia sends 3 times more oil to Europe than to China, you need new pipelines, or you need more tankers, or you need railroads that are already constrained in terms of their capacity, because now after the pandemic you have to ship everything by railroads anyway, and then you have coal ban on top of it. So again, the same goes for gas, surprisingly, because this is the pipelines, this physical, in a way, bridge between Europe and Russia. It's hard to diversify to others. Russia's geography here is also a big constraint to ship it across such vast territory of Russia. you need a lot of infrastructure to be there in place. And if we had a map here, we could see that energy infrastructure from Russia is heavily geared towards the West. It doesn't ship that much to China. This pivot to China has materialized more or less only since 2014, that we saw some tangible infrastructure projects, energy projects that have been redirected to that side. But historically, this dependency remains. So for Russia to reroute and to announce that they are not dependent on European oil or gas market is, I think, is a bluff, because they can't just substitute what they ship to Europe, and they can't substitute it shipping to China, Japan, and so on. Japan not going to join anyway. So in this case, I wanted to say, sorry. You have infrastructure bottlenecks, logistical challenges, but also uncertain demand. When it comes to China, China is very particular about placing all eggs in one basket. It emphasizes energy diversification very much, unfortunately, unlike the EU. Maybe should learn a bit more from China. It wouldn't want to be too dependent on Russia, especially in terms of oil, because Russia is already supplying substantial volumes of oil to China with Saudi Arabia. So I doubt how much China would want to have the same toxic relationship as, for example, Germany and Russia had.
Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating.